Okay, so for my book critique, I chose to do Alexander Worth's Russia at War. So one of the reasons why I chose to do Alexander Worth's Russia at War, it's probably considered one of the best sources on this material. It was written way back in the 60s, but Worth actually offers a very unique perspective that a lot of Western journalists don't have. He was born in Britain, but I believe one of his parents was Russian, so he's actually a native Russian speaker. And at the beginning of the war, he was one of, if not the only, Western reporter allowed in the country at the time. I think he reported, I forget exactly which newspaper he reported for in the United Kingdom, but he was allowed access, which, like I just said, a lot of Westerners didn't have because obviously communist Russia was very closed to, outsiders at the time. And so the best part about Worth's book is that it's very, very in depth. For example, it follows the whole story. So it starts, a lot of books you read might just start, at the beginning of the war, they might talk about the Molotov, Ribbentrop Pact, and then they might just start in the war from there. But he goes pretty far back. He goes a couple years before 1939. He kind of explains the situation Russia had been in. And one of the things I really like is that it's a mixture of secondary and primary sources. So, for example, he himself is an excellent primary source because, like I said, he was a reporter. And so what I like is that throughout the book, try to see if I can show you guys in the notes, but in the book, so he talks about certain things. So he talked about, right here, it says from the invasion to the Battle of Moscow. So this chapter is obviously just kind of about the military aspects and talking about the actual setup for the battle, but then he has things in each and every one of his sections called close-ups. So he has a close-up for Stalingrad, he has a close-up for the Black Summer of 1942, he has a close-up for a lot of the major events in the war. And so when he says close-up, he means like he literally was there. So his close-up one, Moscow at the beginning of the war. So he was literally at Moscow in the beginning of the war. And so he has a lot of interviews and he talks a lot about what the atmosphere and what the scene was like in Moscow at the time. So he's not just reading secondary sources or even talking to primary sources who were there. He was literally there. So he talks a lot about what the atmosphere was like and how people felt and some of the things they were saying on the streets. So I really think he does a very good job at providing an in-depth look at what Russia might have looked like during the war. Like I said, I really like that he's a native speaker as well, which is, they're very important to mention that in the intro, because obviously Russia at this time was very insular, so people weren't very open to sharing things. But if you're a native speaker and you don't necessarily have that accent, it's going to open up a lot of opportunities for you, which I think is one of the reasons why he was able to stay. And so this book was finished in the mid to late 60s. So obviously it took some time writing this, so it wasn't just published right after. So I like the fact that he had all of this primary information that he probably could have written a book on, but I think he wanted to wait. So he waited a couple years, a decade or so, in order for a lot of the information to come out, because a lot of the information he talks about in this book, even from the 60s, wasn't out then. And we obviously have much more information now, but from what he did, he has a lot of key information that obviously, like I said, wouldn't have been available at the time. So I like the fact that he waited to actually write and finish the book a little down the line. Also, one of the things I like that he includes a lot are maps. So as you can see, here's a map. I know it's kind of hard to see, but here's a map from the German offensive from 1941 to 1942. And when you're talking about these huge military campaigns like this, especially somewhere like Eastern Europe, where I'm not very familiar with the geography and the cities and things like that, these maps really help you kind of key it in and understand geographically why one city or why one country might be important to another. Along with this, Worth himself, like I said, wasn't a historian. He's actually a reporter. So one of my favorite things about this book is, it's very, very dense. I think it's 1,200 pages. It's a very dense book. But it doesn't read like a normal historical book does. So, for example, the opposite of this book is called Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by William Scher, another book I read for my research. It's about the same size, but it's way more dense. It's not as colorful as this. This has a lot of color. He writes, even though it is a historical book, he adds a lot of flavor to what he's writing. And it really helps to kind of make the situations come alive, and it really makes it jump off the page. Really kind of almost makes you feel what the people at the time were feeling. So that's probably one of my favorite things about the book. It's just the way he writes and the way he structures his stories really, really does make it for a lot better of a read, a lot more interesting of a read. And so, as I mentioned before, I really just think that the close-ups do a really good job of breaking up the monotony of kind of the military campaigns and just talking about the actual statistics of things. Like when he gets to go into these close-ups, for example, he goes to a close-up in Leningrad after the city had been being sieged by the Nazis for about 3 years. He talks about, what the citizens were talking about and how they were feeling at the time, and it really adds to the color of what was happening. And so this book is very important to me because this is one of the first books I ever read about the Eastern Front. And I read this book about a year or so ago. It was on my Christmas list. But this is one of the things that really got me into the actual topic itself. And so, lastly, I will say one of my favorite things about the book, at least for this edition, is I really like the illustration on the cover. In case you can't see, it's the hammer and sickle, but it's the, it's a knife and sickle for this, but it's a knife and sickle. And the knife is obviously stabbing the swastika and breaking it apart. So I think that adds a good visual, and I like the fact that he replaced the hammer with the knife to kind of signify that this was, wartime Russia.